talked about, so I'm not the odd person out here. And thank you also to Professor Ilchuk of Stanford for her great presentations yesterday and today, and I hope to not tarnish the reputation of the Stanford Slavic department by having the final impression here of Wisconsin really be going down in flames. So this paper today is based partially on my master's thesis from Stanford last year on Isaiah Berlin. But I've narrowed in a little bit to talk more about Isaiah Berlin's treatment of Leo Tolstoy and his philosophy of history. And I'm especially grateful for you all to be having me because the second institution there, St. Matthew Catholic School, is where I teach middle school, and my kids, who are 13 and 14, have heard far more about Leo Tolstoy and Isaiah Berlin than any 13 or 14-year-old wants to or deserves to. So, thank you. And so, we're going to zero in here on Isaiah Berlin, 20th century Russian Jewish philosopher and historian of ideas, essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox. And just to get an idea, how many have read The Hedgehog and the Fox before? Okay, so I was told this would be the case, so I can skim through some of this. So, in The Hedgehog and the Fox, Berlin is positing a bit of a dichotomy here. He draws on the Greek poet Archilochus, who says, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Meaning that hedgehogs, who base their ideas on, quoting Berlin, a single, universal, organizing principle that they consistently return to in their work, and on the other hand, foxes, who, quote, pursue many ends, often unrelated and even contradictory, connected, if at all, only in some de facto way. And although this heuristic may seem simplistic at first glance, Berlin concedes that we can think of Russian literature as having two poles, Dostoevsky on one hand and Pushkin on the other. And again, even if this is simplistic, every comparison and every categorization is going to shed light on something, so I'd like to particularly look at what sort of light it sheds on Leo Tolstoy, who, of course, needs no introduction. And so in The Hedgehog and the Fox, what does Berlin say about Tolstoy? Berlin says that Tolstoy is a fox who believes passionately in being a hedgehog. And because of this, he is in constant contradiction with himself. Hang on, my story gets better. He's in constant contradiction with himself. And what Berlin is saying here is that in his literature, Tolstoy showcases life as diverse. His characters are not devoted to trying to prove any sort of single worldview, but rather they espouse myriad worldviews. Meanwhile, at the same time, in his philosophical writings, or depending on how dedicated you are to becoming a Tolstoyan, his didactic writings, he instead likes to explain historic events with a monist view, encapsulated in what Tolstoy calls the holy truth, истинная правда, of history. But Berlin does not use these words. He just says a monist vision, and where the key to historical events does not lay in the great figures of history, but rather in the sum of millions of individual actions of ordinary men throughout history. Berlin even goes as far as to say that this inability of Tolstoy to reconcile his incisive perceptions of reality with his stringent moral inner compass and code is what contributes to Tolstoy being so tortured and in such a great state of mental and spiritual anguish at the end of his life. And The Hedgehog and the Fox concludes by saying that this is why Tolstoy is, quote, the most tragic of the great writers, a desperate old man beyond human aid, wandering blind at Colonus. Blind at Colonus like Oedipus at Colonus, as we have just seen. And this is a bold claim, to be sure. So I would like to, I'm sure many people are already disagreeing with it, but I would like to save Berlin a little bit and unpack it a little bit more before people start to too vehemently disagree. Admittedly, in The Hedgehog and the Fox, Berlin is working with a very limited reading of Tolstoy. He says actually in just a footnote here that he proposes to limit himself here entirely to the philosophy of history and war and peace, and to ignore Sevastopol stories, the Cossacks, and Tolstoy's other reflections on the subject. So there's the issue of the narrow source base, but it's also helpful to understand a little bit more of who Berlin himself is. Berlin is born in Riga in 1909, which at the time is part of the Russian Empire. And he and his family then moved to St. Petersburg, which is called Petrograd, during the First World War, and he lives there and witnesses both Russian revolutions, the February Revolution as well as the October Revolution. His family and he flee the revolution, he attends Oxford, and then spends the remainder of his life, which spans, as you can see, virtually the entire span of the 20th century, and what he would call the bloody 20th century, there at Oxford in the chair of philosophy. But what is he writing about in the chair of philosophy? He's not typically doing the type of English philosophy that is characteristic of his colleagues and classmates. He attends Oxford with people like Conrad Russell, the son of Bertrand Russell, and he's writing things that are quite different than that. He's writing things that go, in his own words, against the current. This is a collection of very famous essays of his first published in 1979, several editions later. What type of current is he writing against? He's writing against the current of traditional, classic, Western Enlightenment thought in his eyes. The essays in this book are focused on figures like Marx and Moses Hess and Benjamin Disraeli and even Joseph de Maistre. And why is he doing this? As Henry Hardy, there as the editor of this volume and a close personal friend of Berlin, says, he's writing this way because although, quote, Berlin is a classical liberal and a child of the Enlightenment, his liberalism was always embattled. And it's embattled for two reasons. It's embattled because, on one hand, he can't fully get behind the Western narrative of all of 19th century Russian thinkers being these radical monists who build up to an inevitable Russian Revolution. And second, he's going against the current because he likes to go against all sorts of currents. Berlin instead endorses what he calls This is the 19th century Russian intelligentsia's fervent moral opposition to the existing order, which Berlin is trying to push back against. And he's also trying to push back against the understanding that it's either going to be capitalism on one side of this bipolar world or communism on the other side of this bipolar world. As such, quoting Henry Hardy again, many of these 19th century Russian thinkers, who Berlin is trying to perhaps even redeem in the eyes of the West, are, quote, Berlin's heroes, people who refuse to see the world as a single, rational, harmonious whole, but are still interested in an intellectual outlook based on choice and freedom, which again makes them part of this broader category which Berlin calls his value pluralist outlook. Value pluralism being the acceptance of the idea that there can be many truths, many solutions, and many points of view in the world. So, this is well and good. What does this necessarily mean for Berlin's criticism of Tolstoy? Well, I would like to propose here that ultimately, paradoxically actually, Berlin is in the same situation he accuses Tolstoy of being in that he is a fox who nevertheless actually ends up really wanting to be a hedgehog because he's constantly coming back to this central hedgehog of idea of value pluralism that actually might cause him to misread Tolstoy. And we're going to explore a broader swath of Tolstoy's works than just Berlin reads to make that point, and then conclude with what this means about Berlin and how it can still prove his relevance today. So to first focus in on Berlin and Tolstoy, to summarize briefly Tolstoy's philosophy of history as he presents it in War and Peace is important because this is essentially all that Berlin is commenting on. Tolstoy is, in brief, pushing back against this great man narrative of history. The two largest figures historically that loom in War and Peace are, on one hand, Field Marshal Kutuzov, and on the other, Napoleon. And Tolstoy cuts them both down to size, even though, of course, I suppose they are both already short to begin with. On one hand, you get Kutuzov, who at best becomes overly idiosyncratic in that he insists on saying prayers at certain times of the day, he venerates the Orthodox icons before battle, and is obsessed with the mud on the boot of his troops before battle rather than any sort of plans. And on the other hand, Napoleon is not even idiosyncratic, he is just outright a poor leader who is, quote, small and insignificant compared to the forces of history he is supposedly setting in motion. And for the most part, both of them, Kutuzov and Napoleon, for the most part, what happened in these great historic battles is the opposite of what they commanded to be done. So, they aren't the driving forces of history here in War and Peace. Instead, Tolstoy proposes that the driving force of history is what Berlin does pick up on. The millions of individual, well, maybe not millions, but millions in the grand scheme of things, hundreds of thousands in this historical narrative, individual wills that sum together. He has a passage in War and Peace about how the outcome of the battle is determined by whether one Frenchman makes a shot and the Russian misses, or rather two men engage in hand-to-hand combat, which one of them is victorious. That's all these summed up is what's going to actually determine the outcome of the battle. And brilliantly summed up here in a passage from André, speaking with Pierre before the Battle of Borodino, he says that he is not there making preparations with the generals because instead it's going to be the actions of these individual soldiers that are going to determine the day, and in quite Tolstoyan fashion, one of Pierre's subordinates, a peasant, Timokhin, says, "Your Excellency, that's the truth of it, the holy truth, istinaya pravda." So, what is this holy truth? Berlin doesn't really explain it to us. He just seizes on this in a strict rejection of this scientific history or laws of history a la Hegel or Marx, that history is determined and can be just mapped out. He seizes on what he clearly sees in Tolstoy as a sort of democratization of the historical causation amongst these thousands of people, and that there's even a bit of contingency in history, and there's chance certainly just plays a large role in summing up what carries the day in this battle. And he again says that Tolstoy is a fox who desperately wants to be a hedgehog because he's coming back to this central point. But he doesn't comment on the fact that the central point for Tolstoy here is this istinaya pravda, that he says burns like a holy flame within the soul of every Russian soldier. And putting aside maybe any sort of national tendencies, it's clear that there's something a little bit deeper going on here than something that's just a rejection of scientific history a la Hegel or Marx. And if we look outside of War and Peace, we can really see this view, the same view of historical causation is present from the beginning of Tolstoy's career in Sevastopol stories all the way towards the end in the Cossacks, already hinting at a bit of a hedgehog tendency that Berlin was not want to fully embrace. And if this holy truth is indeed religiously based, and Tolstoy is a religious thinker throughout a broader swath of his career than a just pre-confessional and post-confessional Tolstoy, then he is indeed a very modest thinker, and Berlin refuses to acknowledge this at all. So where will we look? We'll look in the exact same places that Berlin told us he did not look. Sevastopol stories, the Cossacks, and Tolstoy's own scattered reflections on the subject. For sake of time, I'll just focus here on Sevastopol stories, where two commonalities are echoed in War and Peace over a decade later. The first is he takes things to an absurdist level. In War and Peace, he has a passage where Louis XIV was a very stupid man, and he governed France poorly, so the French started killing each other. And one Frenchman was very good at killing others, so they all started following him. Similarly, here in Sevastopol stories, he has an absurdist example that I don't understand why all of us are here fighting these Englishmen. We could have 100,000 of us get together, or we could have 1,000, or we could have 100, or we could just go one-on-one, and that would accomplish the same deal. So he has the same sort of attitude to this farcical, clownish understanding of what war is. And there's also that democratization of these key aspects of the battle. As in Sevastopol in December, written in a second-person perspective, he says that it's quite possible when you are at an artillery emplacement, the naval officer isn't going to pay any attention to orders and he'll just start firing just because he feels like it, right? Furthermore, even there's greater hints of this istinaya pravda being there as well. He concludes Sevastopol in May with asking who the hero of his story is. And the hero of my story, whom I love with all my heart, is truth. Here not using istinaya pravda, but just pravda. And if you're wondering about perhaps the debate between the two meanings of truth, we can certainly address that in Q&A. It's especially noteworthy that he writes this here in May, because if you look at Tolstoy's diaries from this same year, just a few months prior, March of 1855, he is pointing out that he wants to, quote, "He has found a new religion, fit for the evolution of humanity, a religion of Christ, but stripped of faith and high mysteries, a practical religion, which does not promise future beatitude, but gives beatitude and truth on earth." And again, using the word pravda, just a few months before he writes it here in Sevastopol Stories. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So, to continue on his religious views, I'm probably speaking a little slowly, so I'll skim through some of this, but this is what I would consider his scattered reflection on the subject. To just highlight one example from "The Kingdom of God is Within You," he still continuously refers to the sole meaning of life being the recognition and profession of the truth by every man, here using Istina. And again, returning back to that conception of this holy truth burning within every Russian soldier, and that's what's determining the outcomes of history. Admittedly, this religious portion of Tolstoy's thought is a bit more contentious within Slavic literature. Of course, there's people like that really believe in the resident and stranger narrative of Tolstoy, and that you can still see them as one and the same thinker and writer. And if that's the case, then Tolstoy has some modest religious views that Berlin does not address. If we choose not to respect that sort of, or not to follow that sort of interpretation of Tolstoy, we can still certainly see a similar historic interpretation across his work, which already hints towards hedgehog tendencies in Tolstoy's historical philosophy of history, which Berlin also refuses to acknowledge. Which brings us to our final point. That, what does this mean for Berlin and his style of intellectual history and political theory? Berlin miscategorizes Tolstoy, as we've hopefully shown, but he still does have some things to teach us. Why does he make this error? Again, because paradoxically, if we could go forward, he is in the same shoes as he accuses Tolstoy of being in. He is a fox who nevertheless returns to this central hedgehog idea. Sorry, back one. Thank you. And how does he reach this conclusion? It's because Berlin really focuses on recreating the mental worlds of his subjects, which he says, if you're not able to step into what these ideas meant to those who were writing them, you won't be able to write a true history of ideas. Unfortunately, as we've hopefully seen, without proper contextualization, this sort of mental recreation can really fall short. And in the words of some of his harsher critics, you can... Oh, sorry. Back. Yeah. No. One forward. I'll stop clicking. Thank you. Okay. You can end up without properly contextualized understandings of these figures that amount to little more than sophisticated glosses that have a one-dimensional quality to them. And ultimately, Mark Lea of Columbia University, who writes the introduction to the latest edition of Against the Current, asks, why do philosophers get things wrong? Berlin's essays suggest that it is less to do with faulty reasoning or lack of imagination than it does with someone's makeup as a human being at the time he happened to write. And ultimately, as Perry Anderson, the brother of Benedict Anderson, whose book has come up several times today, notes that Berlin's proclivity to see value pluralistic characteristics in his subjects is as much the statement of his method as it is an expression of his temperament. And this temperament is what allows him simultaneously to write histories that deal with Marx and Maestri. There are very few scholars who have ever been able to write on the father of socialism and the father of fascism, and deal with both arguably relatively fairly. And he says here, even with something as common as the Renaissance, depending on your ideology, you're going to end up with perspectives of perspectives of perspectives. And it's just as idle to debate which of these perspectives is correct as it is to debate which view of the Alps is true or false. So to conclude here, Berlin has some successes and some failures, and I would argue that he's still worth reading today, both because of these successes as well as because of these failures. His success is that value pluralism is alive and well, certainly in scholarship. It's evident in the varied topics that wonderful presentations that we've heard today, and hopefully we could see more of perhaps in quotidian life and in politics. At the same time, he's also relevant because of his failures, as we've hopefully shown today in his well-intentioned ideology, because I'm sure most people would at least see value pluralism as having good intentions, nevertheless causes him to overlook aspects of Tolstoy's thought, particularly the monist modes of thinking present in his philosophy of history. But nevertheless, Berlin reminds us that the history of ideological positions cannot be written properly except by those who are themselves liable to think ideologically. So, if we are all going to be thinking ideologically as we interpret these thinkers, it would be helpful to remember Berlin's words that not every genius is like one's own image of a genius, and we must read both Tom Paine and Burke. This is the way to learn something. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our presenters.